All right, good evening, guys. We should get started so that you guys are able to get your review done, and then we can get you guys finished up. I've got my questions loaded up here. If you want to add any more, feel free to send them in through. Send them through today's meet, so you're able to get your questions answered. But we'll get started. So first question was on your sheet was, can you explain the conscience wigs? When you look at the conscience wigs, think about the fact that you've got in this unit the disintegration of the Whigs that are starting now, and then the Democrats are going to start disintegrating in the 1850s in the next chapter. And the disintegration of the Democrats is going to happen around Kansas, Nebraska, movement of slavery out west. So the conscience Whigs are the ones who are northern Whigs who can't go along with the pro-slavery stance that the southern Whigs have taken, and so they're choosing not to get involved in slavery and expansion and other sorts of things that they find are sectionally dividing the country. And so that's what the conscience Whigs are about. It's just signaling to you that the northern and southern Whigs are starting to disintegrate, and they're moving in different directions. Next question is, can I explain the gag resolution? Gag resolution is going to be happening from 1836 to 1844 in the House of Representatives. There's going to be another one that's going on in the Senate. Both of them are going to be put into place, making it against the rules in that body of Congress to bring up any laws that are anti-slavery. And the reason why they're doing that is they're afraid that abolitionist laws, anti-slavery laws, will end up tearing the North and the South apart. And so instead of running the risk of having that happen, they're going to instead make those sorts of discussions not illegal, but against the rules. And so they won't consider any anti-slavery laws or open any sort of anti-slavery discussions during that period. In 1845, there's enough Northerners who are in Congress abolitionism that they're able to squash the creation of the gag rule. So the gag rule is created at the start of each session of Congress during that time to shut down with slavery discussions. What is the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty? The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty is a treaty that is dealing with the Isthmus of Panama, and so it's dealing with Central American countries, because there's been a feeling when you've got North America, Central America, South America, you've got a huge problem going on the west coast of the United States, where you have to travel all the way around South America to get up to the other side. Many people have been talking about building a canal through through Central America so they can connect the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean. Clayton-Bulwer Treaty is an agreement that America and Britain are not going to be getting into conflict with one another over the creation of this zone, where they're trying to plot out ideas as far as how they're going to do a canal through the area. Let me see here. What caused the idea of manifest destiny, and when did it end? Manifest destiny is a term that is coined midway through the movement out west, and so it's less about the origination of the idea. The origination of the idea is just westward expansion by white settlement out west. This is something where if you want to play around with the idea of where did this come from, some people would run it all the way back to colonial times, with the idea that people starting off on the coastline started working their way into the interior, moving Native Americans out of the way to allow white settlement to take place. The common definition of it is going to be that period in the 1830s, 1840s, where we have expansions into Texas and the California territory with Mexico and Oregon territory, and the thoughts of moving into like Cuba or other sorts of places. But typically manifest destiny is seen as the movement along the American continent to move from East Coast to West Coast, and it's kind of a shorthand used for that. We're going to have conversations in class when we start getting into the imperialism portion of our course, where we're going to see America moving into Puerto Rico, Philippines, Cuba, Guam, and we'll be able to see a lot of comparisons between those ideas and manifest destiny to be able to link those together. Next question is about the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party is just a political party created in the 1840s, 1850s, with the idea of keeping any African Americans, both free or slave, out of the western frontier. There was a feeling that we talked about in class where many white factory workers who were immigrants in the North were afraid of ending slavery because they were afraid that their job might be jeopardized. Many farmers out in the western frontier are feeling that way as well. And so they're asking for a party that puts forward the issue of keeping African Americans out of the western frontier, regardless of what their status is, so they're not competing with white people. That party is going to be around momentarily, and the reason why they're inside your textbook is when we see the Whigs break into a northern and southern chunk, they're going to be divided. Then there's going to be third parties like the Know Nothings, the Free Soilers, and other parties that will pop up. And eventually the northern Whigs will merge together with a lot of these third parties to create the Republican Party, which, because a lot of them don't want to allow African Americans out west, will make the South even more paranoid than what we were talking about in class today. Let me see here. What was the American Colonization Society, and why was it important? The key reason why we focus on the American Colonization Society is when we think about our political spectrum, we talk about movement from the center being a measure of how much change people want and what extremes they're willing to go to make change happen. So when we take a look at the American Colonization Society, it's a liberal movement from the status quo. It's not a huge change, and especially when people start realizing that it's not making much of an impact on slavery. Most people are not allowing their slaves to go back to Africa, especially because of the fact that the slaves are becoming so valuable and expensive since we've shut down the external slave trade. For many white Americans, though, the American Colonization Society seems like a really good way of calming their conscience while saying that they're doing something about slavery, even if nothing much is getting done. And it shows you the lack of knowledge that many people have, or the lack of curiosity, when they're making comments like sending Africans back to Africa, ignoring the fact that Liberia is not the place where these people were coming from in the first place. And even if it was, they've been here for generations. And so the idea of going back to Africa is absurd. And so that's what the American Colonization Society is about. It's gradualism, and that's a terminology we want to be able to use. Later on, we're going to create the American Anti-Slavery Society, which, instead of doing gradualism, they want abolition. They want to end slavery immediately, and they're not concerned about what happens to the slaves after they're free, because slavery is so evil, they want to end it immediately. Next question. What were the long and short-term effects of the Mexican-American War? Short-term effects is that America is going to get a huge chunk of the western frontier. That's modern-day New Mexico, Arizona, chunks of Texas, California, Oklahoma, those sorts of places. The long-term impacts are what we were discussing today. Compromise of 1850, that battle that we have over what should the designation for those states be. It's also going to stoke the idea of being a filibuster and moving out into the western frontier to into the Caribbean, Central America, South America, to take over territory to expand slavery. It also is going to create the tensions that will split our country during the Civil War, because now that we've got a competition for all that western land that's outside the Louisiana Purchase, it's going to create a lot of tensions between North and South. Did the ports in China and Japan affect politics back in the States? Not a ton, but I mean, you're going to have a group of people eventually over the next 50 years who will get into a battle over imperialism, with the idea that some people think America should try to catch up with the Europeans and become more imperialistic, or build an empire by conquering weaker countries that are nearby. When we get to the 1890s, we're going to see America start moving into China with something called the open door policy, because China's too weak to protect themselves from Americans or Europeans who are moving in to try to exploit trade inside their country. For Japan, there's a desire to try to work deals with Japan to save our sailors and to trade stuff overseas. The big impact that you have from this chapter in the 1840s is when Japan sees us come steaming into their harbors with modernized boats. China at this point was still very much operating as it had for centuries previous, with martial arts, not modern technologies like industry. Same thing with Japan. Japan still had samurais, the Bushido Code, and when America showed up with their technologies, big steamships and so on, it really convinced the Japanese that they were falling behind, and so they're going to start ramping up their technology to try to catch up with the United States and also compete as an imperialistic power too. So it's a long ways off, but a century later, a lot of this competition is going to lead to Pearl Harbor, where Japan and the United States will battle each other over control of the Pacific. die out in Chapter 18. The Democrats aren't going to die out in Chapter 18. They're just starting to run into trouble. It's the Whigs who are going to die out by going into a northern and southern sectional party where they're going to be able to get Zachary Taylor elected in 1848, but then they're done getting people elected on the national stage. The Whigs are going to fall apart because they can't take a stance on slavery. In 1844, they're divided over should Texas be admitted as a free state or a slave state? What should we do with Mexico? The Democrats don't have those tensions. You see tensions building, though, in Chapter 18 and then in Chapter 19, where you're having a northern and southern Democratic Party that's divided on how radical and extreme they should be over the issue of slavery. The South has got Democrats who would be known as fire eaters, where they're so passionate about their issue they'd be willing to eat fire. The North doesn't have that on these issues, and so many Northern Democrats are going to be okay with slavery, but not nearly to the extremes that the Southern Democrats are doing, and they're going to fracture their party in 1860. So that's when the ultimate divide is going to happen. We're going to divide into a Northern and a Southern Democratic Party. Those two will end up splitting their votes, and they'll allow Lincoln to get all the Republican votes and become the president, which will split the country in half. What was the impact on America by the Opium War? Not a ton. The reason why they're telling you about that is, again, to set up what's going to be happening in the late 1800s. And so England, by moving in with the Opium Wars, they're going to help the people in China become addicted to opium, and then they'll be the only supplier of that opium. That'll make the Chinese dependent on them. It'll weaken their social structure, and it'll allow Britain and other people start moving in and taking over territories. When we get to the late 1800s, we're going to see the after effects of that, where each of these European countries later will start taking over ports on the coastline of China so they can trade exclusively with the Chinese. And the Americans, since they're late to that situation, that Americans are going to get involved in China. Then they're going to have a big civil war. Then they're going to focus on themselves and internal expansion out west in the late 1800s, especially in the Indian Wars of the late 1800s. And when you've got a focus back on China, by that point, Europeans have taken over all the ports in China, and America will just barge in and announce that there's an open door policy that they have where they can go into any port that they want to. So we're foreshadowing about 6-7 chapters in the future, but eventually that's where that's going to come play out. We had a rural 1844. American War and they saw this as a great moment in U.S. history. Your problem, though, is in Congress you have some abolitionists, and especially in the House of Representatives, they've got some power. And so the power of the purse, the people who get to decide money decisions, is in the House of Representatives. So James K. Polk asked Congress to pay for the Mexican-American War and to give him money to settle with the Mexicans so that we could buy their territory from them. The House of Representatives created a deal where they would pay for the war, but they also attached a provision or a proviso to the bill that was coming through. And so the bill said that they were going to pay for the bills from the Mexican-American War, but then also the David Wilmot provision or proviso said we're also not going to allow any black people into the territory out west that we claim from Mexico. So this is a free soil decision that's happening here. The bill gets killed in the Senate in 1848. It gets killed again the year afterwards. And so there's these bills that keep popping up and that Wilmot keeps messing with because of the fact that he wants to figure out a way to freeze African Americans out of the western frontier and especially slaves. So it's that Wilmot proviso that we discussed in class where for Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, they're asking, why are you doing the Wilmot proviso if only just to pick on the South? I mean, otherwise it doesn't make any sense because California, because of the gold rush, already wants to have slavery. New Mexico's never going to have slavery because they're a desert. And so there's a feeling that this isn't just about stopping the spread of slavery. It's also meant to send a message and to insult the South about where they could take slaves. And that's going to cause a ton of tension between them. Said, what bill killed the relationship between the North and the South permanently? Trick question. What we're doing is we're building up a series of events. So instead of thinking of it that way, think of it instead like John C. Calhoun talked about, that there's a number of different threads that at different points, if the North is willing to cave in and give the South what they want, then there's a chance that the Civil War could be averted. The fear that the North has, though, is if they keep caving in and caving in, we call a behavior like that appeasement. where you're trying to appease the other person by giving them what they want, but you might be teaching them just that if they keep asking and throwing temper tantrums, they'll just keep doing it over and over again. Because like you saw with the nullification crisis, the South learned the lesson that if they scream really badly and claim they're not going to follow federal laws, we'll create a compromise tariff to make them feel better. And so there's some people in the North who are questioning what sort of compromises they should be making through the 1850s, and that's going to create the divisions that will split our country. Your hard ciderites in Chapter 17, I assume that they're talking about people who helped get William Henry Harrison elected. Hard cider is an alcoholic beverage that poor people will drink during this time period, so it's made out of apples, but it's alcoholic. And so it's a common person's drink, and everybody was claiming that William Henry Harrison was drinking that as his favorite beverage to try making people believe that he was somebody who was tight with them. At some point throughout the chapters, they mention a second era of good feelings. Can you explain this and when it started? Sure. What they've got going on with the second era of great feelings is when the Whig Party dies out during the Mexican-American War. There's a period where you've only got the Democrats that are the dominant party, and then you've also got third parties that are out there. With the second era of good feelings, though, it's a misnomer. Because it's essentially describing a time period where you've got hard feelings between the North and the South. So even if you've only got one strong party and a number of weakened parties, you still have a sectional divide that is definitely not feeling good, and so it's causing tensions. Can I explain the Treaty of Kangawa? The treaty that's going on there, you have treaty with China and treaty with Japan. Both of them are opening them up for encounters with the United States. The Japanese treaty that you're referencing is still trying to maintain a closed society in Japan, so they want to still be able to rescue sailors that are on the open seas, and it opens up the possibility for trade in the future. But it still is also an attempt by Japan to try to hold on to some of their personal independence that they've had in the past. Will the battles of the Mexican-American War be important to know on the test? You should have an idea of the major turning points with the war. Zachary Taylor transitioning to Winfield Scott, and the battles around Mexico City. But it's more the trends of the war rather than the individual battles. So remember, what caused the war? What were the big turning points? What were the after effects? Are going to be the keys that you'll want to lock into. Can I explain the Mason-Dixon line? Mason-Dixon line is pretty simple. So if you think about our boundaries, some of them are straight in state borders, some of them are jagged. The jagged ones are usually either rivers or other natural landmarks. The straight lines, though, are measured by a surveyor to determine where the boundary line is. So in between Pennsylvania and Maryland, you've got a straight line that runs along the border here. Those lines were drawn by the surveyors Mason and Dixon. Because Maryland has slavery and Pennsylvania does not, it's also an informal boundary between the North and the South. When you move further out west, the Mason-Dixon line comes to an end at the end of the border of Maryland and Pennsylvania, but then you have the Ohio River that moves on from that point. That also helps to create the separation between the North and the South as far as free states versus slave states. Can I explain what Abraham Lincoln meant by the spot resolution? Sure. So when you think about the spot resolution, you've got the Nueces River that is right here that was supposed to form the southern boundary of Texas. This is what the Mexicans claim is the boundary for Texas. You've also got the Rio Grande that the Americans wanted to have as their boundary for Texas. So you've got this open area right here that's disputed, where the Mexicans are arguing that this territory belongs to Mexico, it doesn't belong to Texas. James K. Polk wanted to pick a fight, though, and so he sent his troops across the Nueces River into this disputed area. And when he arrived in that area, the Mexicans were prepared, and they started shooting at the Americans for invading disputed Mexican territory. James K. Polk used that as an argument to claim that we were attacked on our own sovereign soil, and we should treat this as a defensive war. So when Abraham Lincoln's asking to see that bloody spot, what he's saying is if that bloody spot is in between these two rivers, you've started an illegal land war, you're a war criminal, and we should end this war immediately and not support it because we're the evil ones who are being aggressive to our neighbors. Lincoln's saying if the spot is above the Nueces River, then it's a legal war because we were attacked on our home territory. Polk understands the argument, This is being made by a really young politician, and so James K. Polk just chooses to ignore Abe Lincoln and go on and fight this war, which is really popular in the South, but not so much in the North. What happened with the Ostend Manifesto? So that's an event that happened during the Franklin Pierce presidency. Ostend Manifesto is an announcement that was made by the Americans to the Spanish, which is very similar to the announcement they made with the Mexicans. They tried to buy Cuba for a lump sum of cash, but then they also started making noise about the idea that if Cuba wasn't sold to the Americans by the Spanish, and quickly we were going to think about using military measures to invade Cuba and take Cuba away from the Spanish. This was all supposed to be top secret, and then the information got out. And when the information got out, Northerners who were abolitionists were fearful that what they saw happening in Cuba was a repeat of what we had with the Mexican-American War, and the attempt to try to grab an awful lot of land for slavery was something that the Northerners weren't interested in. So this whole plan fell apart. Cuba was not conquered by the United States at the time, and this helps to be another sectional division that will split the North and the South. What motivated the early abolitionist movements? The early abolitionist movements with the American Colonization Society, they're going to be motivated by Republican principles of freedom, liberty, equality, but also the idea that segregation was okay because they really excited about black people and white people living together. When you're talking about the radical abolitionists of like Garrison and Sojourner Truth and those guys, they're inspired by the Second Great Awakening. And so the religious movement that sweeps through the United States asks them to look for evil where they can find it. And the fact that most of the European countries by this time had outlawed slavery because it was something that was seen as immoral is going to motivate a lot of people to start moving against slavery in a much more radical fashion. In the Green Review book is asked about popular sovereignty. I thought it was about the choice of slavery in the state, but it said that government in each territory should be elected by the people. Okay, I got you, Josh. So, Josh, what I want you to be thinking about with popular sovereignty, it's got two different elements that's going along with popular sovereignty. So popular means people, sovereignty means rule, so people rule. You're going to have, with popular sovereignty, a decision inside the state where at the basic level, it's the idea that people should be in control of their democracy and making decisions about who their leadership is, what their ideas are, what their rules are, and so on. If you take it to the next logical extension, though, it's also revolving around the idea, like the Kansas-Nebraska Act that we learned about today. Each state should also be given the chance to rule on whether or not they would be a free or a slave state once they've got enough people to apply for statehood. So it's not that the answer they gave you in the Green Book is wrong, but it's a little bit too general for what our purposes are in this class. We really want to be tuned into the idea that popular sovereignty is really important when it comes to slavery. What is the importance of the spot resolution? Got that one done. Why did Henry Clay lose the election in 1844 to Polk? This is about the division of the Whigs. So when we think about the Whig Party and we have the election of 1844, this is when we're battling over Texas. And should we add Texas to the United States? Because it's been sitting there ever since Jackson's presidency, and we couldn't decide if we're going to add it or not. And so for the Whigs, you've got Henry Clay, who is part of a party that's a northern/southern party that has now got a bunch of abolitionists who are starting to make their way into the group. And so when he's asked, should we absorb Texas, he's got a problem, because if he's too excited one way or the other, he's going to split half of his party away. So if he's too excited about slavery, then the North is gone. If he's not excited enough, the South is gone. And so he could just get squishy in 1844. He just says, I'm not really sure what we should do with Texas. It seems kind of like the wrong thing to mess around with. So he just wants to be hands off. In this most recent election that we just had, you saw how excited people can get by a politician who, instead of being squishy like a politician, instead is charismatic like Donald Trump was. And so James K. Polk came out with a statement where he said, I'm going to take everything. I'll take Texas, I'll take California, I'll take Oregon. I like Manifest Destiny. He's not ashamed of the idea of being aggressive to try to take territory. And that's what's going to help him out an awful lot, and it's going to hurt Henry Clay. We already explained the Wilmot Proviso, so hopefully we're good with that. What was the consequences of outlawing the slave trade between Britain and the United States? When the slave trade was outlawed by the British, they also have the biggest navy on the face of the planet, so the British are prowling out in the Atlantic Ocean, and if they find smugglers who are trying to sneak slaves across the ocean, they'll capture the ship, they'll capture the slaves. Occasionally a ship will be close to the United States, and so they'll dump the slaves here inside the United States, and they typically find their way into slavery if they were left in the southern states. But typically what's happening is the British are putting pressure onto the United States to think about being abolitionists, because slavery and that culture seems kind of backwards to them. Where were the German and Irish immigrants during the later parts of these chapters? Most of them are settling in the north. Germans oftentimes are settling as farmers. Irish people are oftentimes settling in the cities to work in factories, or else they're moving to places like Appalachia to work in mining or lumberjacking or that sort of stuff. And so they're finding homes in the north, much less so in the south. There's not a lot of opportunities for immigrants who are moving in there, and so the movement is much less in the south. Will you be going into the importance of the Tappans and the Beechers? There's not a deep dive that's needed with those guys. Those are two religious families from the Second Great Awakening who make it their focus that they want to focus not just on being religious, but also on the Second Great Awakening and its connection to abolitionism. And so these are abolitionist families that will be fighting against the slavery movement that's happening here inside the United States. The Beecher family is going to be important because when you hear about a Harriet Beecher Stowe who creates Uncle Tom's Cabin, she's one of the daughters in the family who is carrying on that tradition by writing that novel. Like the last test, are we going to have a passage to analyze? Yes. What was the 7th of March speech? The 7th of March speech was the speech delivered by Daniel Webster that we looked at today, where Daniel Webster is largely echoing the statements that Henry Clay had, that the Wilmot Proviso doesn't make sense in New Mexico territory because that territory is already set aside as a desert, so there's not going to be slavery moving in there. And that's where Daniel Webster is talking about union being the most important thing, secession is unthinkable, and he destroys his reputation in Massachusetts a good amount by being less aggressive about slavery than many of the abolitionists would like him to be. But his speech really does a ton to try to calm down Southerners who are being pretty paranoid about what the Northerners are about by convincing them that there are Northerners who are willing to work with them for the purpose of holding the Union together. So let me see here. I see no more questions. I'll give you a second more to think about that. I'm excited to be here with you guys tonight. We just killed it in basketball tonight. The kids were amazing. I've drawn up plays in the back of my notebook, and they just executed like crazy. 10-year-old basketball is awesome. I'm being a little sarcastic. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I'm assuming you guys are good. I'll be checking emails for a little while longer before I turn in for the night. Also, you can buzz by and ask any sort of questions you guys have tomorrow. But tomorrow we'll take how was my day? Luke, you're so nice. It was fab. Yours? I'll drop off any sort of questions, or else if you want to send me an email, that's fine. But for you guys, good luck with your studying tonight. Let me know if I can help out in any way. And I'm excited to see you well tomorrow. Good night, you guys.